Good morning, everyone. I'd like to thank you for joining us this morning and for the QStraint SureLok changes to wheelchair transportation and regulations. Joining us this morning is the QStraint and SureLok team. We have Darren, the regional sales manager. He will be presenting this morning. We also have Aaron, their marketing coordinator, Cassie Vaughn, marketing manager. Bob Joseph will probably be joining us later on. Craig Gerald, he's the OEM Business Development Manager, and Jim, their Director of Sales. We do appreciate you joining us, and I'm quite sure you will gain a lot of knowledge out of this presentation. With that said, Darren, if you'd like to take it away.
Sure. Thanks, Gina. So we really appreciate all of you guys being here. The topic we're going to cover today is that there are some pretty significant changes coming to the regulations that govern the state transport of wheelchair passengers that are scheduled to take effect over the next year and a half. And really for you guys as dealers is that these changes are going to have a significant impact on the type of wheelchair securement equipment that is used going forward. So we're not going to spend a ton of time talking about those changes to the securement equipment in this presentation. But what we are going to try and do is cover the regulatory changes that are going to lead to those changes in securement equipment. And part of the reason why that's really important for you guys is you're going to start to be approached by your customers and end users about these regulations, and it's important for you guys to understand what's happening in the field, what led to those regulatory changes, and ultimately how to best help your customers comply with them going forward. So we're going to talk very briefly at the end about what this means for the product you guys will be selling, but for the bulk of this presentation, we're really going to cover sort of the regulatory changes that are going to affect the transport of wheelchair passengers. Okay? So, and I do think, in many respects, it's going to be an exciting time to be a transportation provider as these changes start to take place over the next couple of years. Because, for the most part, what's going to happen is it's going to result in your customers working with, really for the first time ever, wheelchairs and wheelchair securement equipment that have truly been designed to complement each other and work together seamlessly. So, the outcome of that is really going to be that it's going to dramatically improve both the ease of transporting wheelchairs and, most importantly, the safety of those wheelchair passengers. And when wheelchair transport gets easier and safer, it also dramatically reduces the liability for transportation providers. So, I mean, I think these changes are dramatic enough that 10, 15 years down the road, people are going to look back on 2014 and wonder why transporting wheelchair passengers caused so much consternation to begin with. So, with that in mind, what I really hope you guys get out of this is a sort of a detailed understanding of the changes that are coming at the end of 2015, and I want to leave you guys prepared to, one, respond to the demands of your customers that are going to be asking you about these regulations, and to leave you prepared to help them comply with them and benefit from them going forward. Okay? So before we jump into all the regulations, I wanted to give you guys just a brief overview of QStraint SureLok and explain to you why it is that we're the ones here talking to you about these regulatory changes. So for those of you who aren't as familiar with us, QStraint and SureLok, we're sort of the two largest manufacturers of wheelchair securement equipment in North America, and those two companies merged in 2010. And as a result, between the two companies, we have over 50 years of wheelchair securement knowledge and expertise. Both companies were in existence long before all the regulations that we're going to discuss were in place, and in many instances, we really aided in the creation of those regulations and best practices that we're going to discuss, especially those early regulations. And today, we're probably a larger company than a lot of you realize. We're in 50 countries around the world. Just here in North America, we have 13 regional sales managers, 11 engineers, 9 customer service reps, all of whom are solely focused on wheelchair securement. So that's all we do. That's all we manufacture. We don't have our hands in any other industries. It's a family-owned company that solely focuses on wheelchair transportation. And I think we're all, as employees of the company, really proud that the culture of the company is really one in which we sort of feel an ethical obligation that selling a product that's designed to provide safety to those with disabilities carries with it an obligation to make sure we educate our customers on how to best use that product to ensure passenger safety. So as a result, I and pretty much every member of our sales team provides far more trainings or regulatory assistance presentations like the one we're doing today than we do purely trade shows or sales events. So this is very much sort of these educational presentations are very much within the spirit of the company. Okay, so before we can really get into the upcoming changes to regulations, I think it's important to first take a step back and look at the landscape of legislation and regulations governing wheelchair transport. Okay, so really there are sort of two main regulations that up until this point have really governed the transport of wheelchair passengers. Okay, and the first of those is the Americans with Disabilities Act that was passed in 1990 by both houses of Congress and signed into law by George H.W. Bush. And to give you an idea of the sort of support this legislation had at the time, the Americans with Disabilities Act actually passed the Senate by a vote of 98-2. So I know in 2014 it's difficult to imagine anything passing through the Senate and Congress, let alone with that kind of bipartisan support. So there really was a groundswell of support for the need to provide access to a lot of different areas of life for people with disabilities. And the American with Disabilities Act is really best viewed as sort of civil rights legislation. It was a wide-ranging law. It affected a lot of areas of life besides transportation. But as far as transportation goes, it's really best viewed as a bare minimum set of legal requirements governing access to transportation, but not necessarily safety. Okay, so in fact, while the Americans with Disabilities Act guaranteed that all vehicles were accessible to people with disabilities, it said very little about how to properly secure and provide safe transport for those passengers. So essentially all it really said is that transportation providers must provide an accessible space, and for wheelchair passengers, some form of securement equipment. But it didn't go into much more detail than that in terms of specifying what type of securement equipment it should have or how that securement equipment should work. Okay? So that was 1990, and in every respect, ADA was really a landmark moment in the transport of wheelchair passengers. It got the ball rolling. It got key stakeholders thinking about really the best ways to provide accessible transportation. But it also quickly became apparent that while ADA guaranteed access, it didn't go far enough in terms of safety. So, in other words, it was a necessary first step, but it wasn't really sufficient to providing safe transport for wheelchair passengers. So, recognizing this void, the Society of Automotive Engineers set out to fill it. And in 1996, 6 years after ADA, they published their standard, SAE J2249. And this standard was really aimed at wheelchair securement manufacturers, and it governs the design, manufacture, testing requirements, and use of wheelchair securement equipment. And unlike ADA, SAE J2249 is not law, so you're not obligated to follow it, but it was best viewed as sort of a legally recognized best practice standard. And what I mean by that is, say, for example, you are a transportation provider and you decide to purchase wheelchair securement equipment that didn't meet this SAE J2249 standard. You were to have an incident and you were to find yourself in a courtroom, it would reflect very poorly on your case. You would find yourself trying to explain why you decided to ignore these legally recognized best practice standards when you spec your bus and purchase securement equipment. So for that reason, though sort of to reduce liability, but also because of a desire to actually provide the best, safest form of transportation for their passengers, it became really the securement standard for wheelchair tie-down equipment that was specified by almost every transportation provider, from departments of transportation to departments of education. In fact, it's really unusual today to find any type of specification for a vehicle accessible vehicles that does not include SAEJ 2249 as part of their requirements for securement equipment. It's part of, as you guys probably know, the National School Transportation Specifications and Procedures as well. Okay? So those are really, up until now, those have been the two major regulations governing wheelchair securement transportation. So what has been the result of this? So obviously, as opposed to prior to 1990, where this industry was totally unregulated, wheelchair securement has dramatically improved. So for some of you who have been in the transportation industry a while, you probably remember some of the unregulated securement contraptions and monstrosities that used to be out there. Right, you had the claw, right, which would sort of grab the wheel and in the process end up destroying it if you were in an accident. You had these bars that would run through a wheel. You had people bunch cording wheelchairs. And then, of course, there was my favorite method of wheelchair securement, which was load the wheelchair, apply the wheel locks, and pray to whatever deity you happen to believe in that nothing happens to the passenger on the trip. And that sounds like a joke, but one of the first employees of QStraint prior to ADA went to give a presentation for the New York essentially paratransit division on wheelchair securement equipment. And before the presentation, asked the director if he could go back and take a look at a number of the vehicles and see what they were using to secure wheelchairs. And he said, "Sure, I'd be happy to show you." And he walked him to a vehicle where the accessible positions were in the front of the vehicle, right behind the driver's seat. And he said, "Right, so when we want to secure a wheelchair, what we do is we get in the driver's seat, we hold the wheel with our left hand, and we reach around with our right hand and hold the wheelchair." So, I mean, that really was the extent of what was out there prior to these regulations. So, obviously, all these regulations have improved wheelchair securement, but in the process, something else is recognized, and that is that the wheelchairs themselves were really the weakest link in ensuring passenger safety in an event of a crash. So, while there were a lot of regulations governing wheelchair securement equipment, there weren't any governing the manufacture or transport of the wheelchairs. And as a result, wheelchair manufacturers were really slow to adapt their chairs and design them to be transported safely. In fact, in most cases, even today, wheelchairs are coming with a disclaimer that says something along the lines of what you see on this slide. You know, a wheelchair should never be used as a seat in a moving vehicle. Okay, so right away they're indemnifying themselves against any liability when it comes to transporting someone. So in essence, what you were doing after ADA and SAEJ 2249 is you were taking a strong, crash-tested securement equipment and attaching it to a wheelchair that wasn't crash-tested, regulated, or even designed to be transported to begin with. So in many respects, as great as ADA was and SAEJ 2249 was, they were really making the best of a less-than-ideal situation. Okay? And as a result, it wasn't uncommon in the event of a collision to see something like you guys will see in this video right here, where you have a wheelchair that remains secure, but ends up breaking or coming apart in the event of a crash. Okay? So, recognizing this issue, recognizing the disconnect between strong securement system and chairs that weren't designed to be transported, another organization, the American National Standards Institute, which is sort of an umbrella standards organization that oversees a number of standard-making bodies from a wide range of fields and industries, worked together with RESNA, which is the Rehabilitative Engineering and Assistive Technology Society of North America, to really pick up where sort of SAEJ 2249 left off, and research, develop, and publish necessary standards for stronger, safer, transit-ready wheelchairs. Okay, and the goal of their research was really to sort of develop a complete wheelchair transport system, where you had wheelchairs and securement equipment that were really designed to work together seamlessly. So, in 2000, 4 years after SAEJ 2249 was published, ANSI RESNA publishes WC19, which this time is a standard aimed at wheelchair securement, or wheelchair manufacturers, okay? And it regulates the design and testing of wheelchairs that are really aimed to be used as seats in a moving vehicle. Now, it's a voluntary standard, okay? So wheelchair manufacturers weren't obligated to design transport-ready chairs. but it really provided a set of benchmarks for them to meet in order to certify that their chairs were transport-ready chairs, okay? And there were a number of different provisions and requirements for wheelchair manufacturers to meet WC19, but the main requirement was really that those wheelchairs had these 4 clearly identifiable crash-tested securement points that you see here in the presentation, okay? So just let's take a step back and remember how we're securing wheelchairs. So in order to secure a wheelchair in a vehicle, right, operators must determine a good solid location on the wheelchair frame for the attachment of a tie-down hook. And as you guys probably know, on many chairs this can be difficult or sometimes nearly impossible. Now with these WC19 chairs, right, operators didn't need to guess if they were attaching to an appropriate place on the wheelchair frame. They had a clear attachment point that they knew could withstand a crash. Okay? So, in theory, right, as of 2000, you had SAEJ 2249 that governed wheelchair securement equipment, and you now had WC19, which governed transportable chairs. So you should have had really a complete system where chairs and wheelchairs and securement equipment were really designed to work together. And you really shouldn't, your operators and customers really shouldn't have had problems securing wheelchairs. In theory, we should have a complete system. But, of course, that isn't what happened. Okay? So it took a long time for WC19 to gain momentum. And, in fact, those type of chairs have remained really obscure for a long period of time. Okay? So what happened? And I think there are a number of different reasons why WC19, which was published in 2000, really didn't solve the problem as quickly as Nancy Resnick would have thought. I think probably the main reason is that wheelchair manufacturers themselves were slow to modify their wheelchairs because of the added expense, design, engineering, and testing those chairs to meet those requirements. And we can tell you, working for a wheelchair securement company, there is a ton of expense that goes along with crash testing and engineering products to meet these standards. And not every wheelchair manufacturer jumped on board quickly and started making WC19 chairs. So that was certainly one reason. But one of the other reasons was that because those chairs cost more to make, that cost was passed along to the public. So WC19 chairs are more expensive than a traditional wheelchair that costs anywhere from $200 to $500 more than a traditional chair. So there was certainly some reluctance on the part of the public to purchase WC19 wheelchairs and spend that added money at the time of purchase. But I also think there was just a general lack of awareness that these chairs were out there and available. So I'll tell you guys a quick story. I did a 2-day training at a nursing home facility in Massachusetts, a very affluent nursing home facility. And after the first day of training, we covered WC19 chairs and how to secure them. And one of the administrators from the facility came up to me on the second day and said, "Hey, after you talked about WC19 chairs, I did a little bit of research, and all of our residents are eligible to receive a WC19 chair, and it's covered by the health insurance that we require them to be resident at this facility." And I said, "That's great. I mean, securement should be really easy for you guys if you were seeing a lot of these chairs." And the administrator told me, "Yeah, it should be, but we have 1,000 residents here, and we don't have one WC19 chair. So even in instances where these chairs were available and were not an additional cost to the public, I think there was just a general lack of awareness that these chairs were out there." Now, that all started to change in 2011, and it started to change for a couple different reasons. I think, first of all, Nancy Resnick sort of recognized what I had just been talking about, that for whatever reason, these chairs were not gaining the popularity that they expected when they passed WC19 back in 2000. So that was one reason they had made efforts to publicize the standard. But also, there were some attention drawn to the WC19 regulation from various lawsuits. As you guys probably know and hear from your customers, there are a growing number of power chairs that people are using. The chairs are getting larger and larger, and that's led to a lot of incidents that have resulted in major injuries, with chairs breaking, heavy power chairs tipping over because there weren't appropriate attachment points for the securement, or passengers falling out of chairs because occupant restraints weren't used correctly. So that certainly added some publicity for the WC19 standard. But more important than all that, in 2011, the U.S. Department of Veteran Affairs made the decision that going forward they were only funding WC19 wheelchairs. Now, for a lot of you guys who sell primarily to the school bus market, you're probably thinking, well, my customers aren't transporting a lot of veterans. But trust me, when a department like the VA makes a sweeping decision like that, it has large and wide-ranging ripple effects. Okay, so first of all, a giant percentage of new wheelchair purchases are made through the VA. So this has really compelled wheelchair manufacturers to upgrade their devices and start to build more WC19 wheelchairs. And likewise, anytime a government agency like the VA makes a decision like that, other agencies, insurance providers start to follow suit. So over the last couple of years, there's been really a groundswell of other departments and agencies that are funding and covering wheelchair passengers, recommending that these chairs be the chairs that are purchased. And I'll give you a little bit of information later to sort of give you an example of just how much and how much momentum WC19 is starting to gain. So in the wake of that VA decision in 2011, okay, and this sort of added buy-in in WC19 wheelchairs, Resna then decided to go back and take a look at WC19, which at that point in 2012 was 12 years old, and decided to revamp the standard. Okay? And part of the reason for this is since WC19 was originally written, Resna and transportation providers began to notice that while some incidents were certainly the result of incorrectly used tie-downs, actually most of the incidents and accidents that people were seeing with wheelchair passengers were most often the result of incorrectly used occupant restraints. And anyone who's ever tried to secure a wheelchair, this won't be a surprise, right? The occupant restraints are usually the most, or least intuitive and most cumbersome part of securement. So the placement of belts usually requires a fair amount of physical interaction with the passenger, and that makes it undesirable for both parties, right? You have drivers who really don't want to use occupant restraints, and you have riders who just want to be secured as quickly as possible so as not to delay the other non-wheelchair passengers on the vehicle. And further complicating matters, right, you had these larger power chairs that are starting to become more and more popular that really create problems getting proper belt placement and really increase the likelihood that someone is going to use the occupant restraints incorrectly. Okay? So recognizing this problem, when Resna goes back and revamps WC19, they are now requiring all wheelchair manufacturers, in order to meet this WC19 standard, they now must offer an integrated lap belt as part of all WC19 wheelchairs. Okay? And that lap belt must be attached to the chair, okay? It must be crash tested, okay? And they set out crash test standards for that lap belt. And it must be adaptable with current shoulder belt configurations, meaning that you can take that shoulder belt on a vehicle and drag it down and attach it to a pin connector on the lap belt to complete the securement system, okay? So the goal here is really to facilitate the use of lap belts, right? So to sort of eliminate concerns about time, intrusion into the passenger's personal space, and concerns about getting the belts placed properly on the passenger. And if you think about this integrated lap belt is really a game changer for a couple different reasons. I mean, now, if you're a transportation provider, your passengers are entering vehicles already secured to the wheelchair. And that's resulting in less driver-passenger contact. All the driver needs to do to secure the passenger is attach the wheelchair securements to the 4 crash-tested anchorage points, okay, that are on the chair, and then drag that shoulder belt down and attach it to the lap belt, and they're done, okay? So, in essence, it's really completely simplifying the securement process for a wheelchair passenger. So, to give you guys an idea, I mentioned in the last slide that I'll talk about how much momentum the standards are gaining. We at QStraint SureLok sell WC19 crash test lap belts to a variety of wheelchair manufacturers, okay? And in 2011, prior to that VA ruling mandating WC19 chairs, and before this RESNA update of WC19 chairs requiring these crash-tested lap belts, we sold a total between the two companies of fewer than 200 WC19 equivalent lap belts to wheelchair manufacturers. Okay, in 2013, between the two companies, we sold over 2,600 WC19 lap belts to wheelchair manufacturers. So, and we are certainly far from the only company that are selling these belts to wheelchair manufacturers. So that gives you an idea, sort of how the tide has shifted and how popular these chairs have become. Okay. So, in the wake of those changes to WC19 and WC19 being required by the VA and it gaining popularity, RESNA decided that it was also time to go back and take a look at SAEJ 2249. So remember, that's the standard governing wheelchair securement equipment. Okay? And at that point, the standard SAEJ 2249 was 16 years old, and a lot has changed sort of wheelchair transportation since then. And after reviewing SAEJ 2249, in December of 2012, RESNA released a new, revised, and updated, legally recognized best practice standard for wheelchair securement equipment. That was called WC18. So it's called that to sort of complement the WC19 regulation that governs wheelchair manufacturers. Okay, and in many respects, WC18 isn't all that different in terms of the requirements from SAEJ 2249. Okay, we're still required to pass a 30-mile-an-hour 20G frontal crash test with a 185-pound surrogate wheelchair and a 172-pound anthropomorphic test dummy, okay? But there is sort of one really critical distinction, and that distinction is that we are now required to pass that crash test with that WC18 integrated lap belt, okay? So what that means, okay, is that this is transferring the load of both the wheelchair and that passenger, who's now being secured by that integrated lap belt, to back tie-downs in that crash test. And that's resulting in an increased load on those tie-downs by up to 60%. Okay, so if you think about the way current securements work, right, you have the webbing and the tie-downs that are restraining the chair in the event of a crash, but you have the occupant restraints that are used separately, right, and those are usually attached to a pin connector on the top of the retractors or to tracking into the floor. So in that crash, the occupant restraints are restraining the passenger separately from the wheelchair, which is being restrained by those tie-downs. Okay. Now, with the new WC19 lap belt, the retractors are restraining both the passenger and the wheelchair. Okay. So as a result, to be able to comply with the standard, not just QStraint SureLok, but every wheelchair tie-down and occupant restraint manufacturer is going to have to design a new heavy-duty retractor that will be able to handle these increased loads. There's not a retractor on the market today that can pass this WC18 crash test with an integrated lap belt. And RESNA, when it developed this standard in December of 2012, gave all wheelchair tie-down manufacturers until December of 2015. So it's sort of a 3-year window to redesign their equipment to meet this standard. Okay, so this is a standard that isn't going into effect until December of next year, and they gave us this sort of time frame to redesign our equipment. All right, to give you guys just a sort of quick overview of this change, I'm going to show you guys a brief video created by the University of Michigan Transportation Research Institute, who in part helped develop and test these new WC18 standards. In the video, you're going to see Professor Larry Schneider talk a lot about these standards. He's currently chair of the SAEJ 2249 subcommittee and was incredibly influential in developing the new WC18 standard that I just talked about. So I'm going to play the video. If you guys have a hard time hearing or seeing it, Gina's going to send out the link. These videos are all available on our YouTube channel. So Gina will send out the link later. And if for whatever reason you have a hard time hearing it, just bear with us, and we'll send you a link where you can watch it a little bit later. We're going
biosciences research group is all about occupant protection for everybody in motor vehicles. And an area that we're specialized in is people with disabilities, people who use wheelchairs for mobility, and particularly people who cannot transfer out of their wheelchair when they enter a motor vehicle. So they have to sit in the wheelchair when they're traveling in a motor vehicle, whether it's a van, a minivan, a paratransit van, a school bus, or even a large city bus. One of the main tests that is run for all the standards is for wheelchairs or tie-downs and restraint systems is a sled impact test, where we can simulate the crash event that would occur in the real world.
So I run the sled lab here at M3. So the testing that we perform here is typically 30 mile per hour delta Z, which it is a pretty moderate to severe crash.
We test the tie-downs and restraint systems, and we test the wheelchairs, and we test the wheelchair seating systems to the standards that have been developed by the resident, as well as standards that have been developed in the International Standards Organization, which are comparable and similar to the standards we have from RESNA. RESNA is a recognized standards development body that set guidelines for industry so that the people who use them will be safe and so that those products will perform effectively.
The tie-down systems that are out there today, they've been used for years and years, but they may not meet this higher standard that's out there that's required by WC18, WC19.
Well, one of the key things about WC19 that it says about wheelchairs that are used as seats in motor vehicles. The first thing is that it has 4 easily accessible securement points, what we call securement points or brackets, for attaching 4 tie-down straps. It's really adaptable to a wide range of wheelchairs. And it is the only system that is adaptable to those wheelchairs of different types and models. For the past several years, we have been trying to investigate as many real-world crashes and even non-crash events where a person was seated in a wheelchair and something happened, the wheelchair tipped over, or there was a minor crash. What happened to the person in the wheelchair? What happened to the wheelchair? How was the equipment performing? And we learned several things from that. One key thing was that the people were being injured in many crashes and even sudden stop non-crash events coming out of their wheelchair because they did not have an adequate lap shoulder belt system, or because they were using a lap shoulder belt where the wheelchair structures and components, and particularly the arm supports of the wheelchair and the wheels, were interfering with the proper positioning of the lap belt that was anchored to the vehicle floor. We had previously a test for accommodation of wheelchair vehicle-anchored lap shoulder belts. But it was only a matter of testing and disclosing the results. There was no pass-fail to that. You could get a poor rating and still comply with the standard. And that just didn't make any sense to them. And so one of the things that we did in WC19 was say, we're going to make that a pass-fail requirement.
So the WC19 standard now requires that there be a wheelchair-integrated lap belt included on those wheelchairs, which provides for a much better belt fit onto the pelvis of the individual, so that we don't have to worry about belts being whether over their armrests or other wheelchair components that would interfere with a proper belt fit. So this added requirement in the WC19 now adds the occupant weight to the system that needs to be secured to the floor, which puts a lot more loading on the tie-down system.
So one of the things that we decided to include in the new version of WC18 is a higher strength test requirement for tie-down systems. Tie-down restraint manufacturers will need to test their tie-down system or their securement system, whatever it might be, with the surrogate wheelchair that we use to load tie-downs in the WC18 test, and with a surrogate lap belt anchored to that wheelchair that is securing the dummy to the surrogate wheelchair. So those rear tie-down straps are going to have to take a lot more load because they're going to be dealing with occupant loads
components to these tie-down systems that meet the WC18 requirements, and they provide an added level of safety so that the system can behave more like the vehicle state would behave.
Well, transit providers, they need to be aware of these standards, and that there are products that comply with these standards. Okay, so they need to know these standards exist, and they need to install and purchase the latest versions of these equipment, because the equipment has improved tremendously over the years. Tie-down restraint equipment has gotten much more usable. The designs have improved, so they're much easier to use, especially if you have a WC19 wheelchair with 4 easily accessible securement points.
Okay, so what do these changes in regulations mean for your customers? Okay, so I think there are really two big takeaways here. The first is that their lives as transportation providers are really going to greatly improve as these standards start to take hold. So they're going to start to see more WC19 wheelchairs that are safer and easier and quicker to secure. All they're going to have to do is attach the hooks to those anchorage points, add the shoulder belt, and they're going to be done. There's going to be no more fussing with occupant restraints. They're going to have a system where the wheelchair securement equipment and the wheelchairs are really designed to work together seamlessly. And that means that their ridership will be more likely to want to use the occupant restraints, and that their drivers are going to are more likely to use them correctly. And all in all, there's just going to be a lot less liability associated with transporting wheelchair passengers and attaching to the correct attachment points in the chair and using the occupant restraints correctly. So, transportation in general and transporting wheelchair passengers, will never be liability-free, but we are really going to be as close as we can get to truly worry-free wheelchair transportation. So I think that's the first big takeaway, that this is really going to improve life for the lives of transportation providers. But the second big takeaway is, just as years ago when SAJ 2249 was published in 1996, forward-thinking transportation agencies wrote it into their specifications to reduce their liability and ensure passenger safety. Okay? After 2015, so after December 2015, those transit agencies are going to have to update their specifications and switch SAEJ 2249 to WC18, which at that point will become the new legally recognized best practice standard for wheelchair securement. Okay, so it'll be 19 years at that point since SAEJ 2249 was written. It was a great standard at the time, but it's no longer going to have the effect once WC18 takes effect in December of 2015 of reducing their liability. Okay, there's a new legally recognized best practice standard that they're going to need to switch over to ensure they get the best securement equipment and that they're reducing their liability. Okay, so really quickly, all of that sort of begs the question: what is the new wheelchair securement equipment going to look like? Right. So we're still in the process of designing equipment to meet the WC18 standard. QStraint, as you guys may have seen, is already advertising for the QRT 360, which will be the first retractor on the market to meet the new WC18 and 19 standards. It's going to work the same way that all our previous securements have worked. So it's a 4-point, fully automatic, self-tensioning retractor. But you'll notice, even by looking at it, once you guys have a chance to see it, it's really heavy duty. It's stronger than any previous retractor that's been manufactured. Just to give you an idea of its strength, we have to pull test the webbing on our current retractors, so the Max and the Deluxe, to 7,000 pounds. In order to meet this standard, we have to do a static pull test in the webbing for this QRT 360 that meets a 12,000 pound standard. So it's almost twice as strong as our previous retractors. We're shooting for sort of September 2014 in terms of availability, and there'll be a new SureLok compliant retractor that meets these standards around the end of the year as well. So we'll have two options well ahead of that December 2015 deadline for meeting the WC18 standard. So before we finish up here, I'm just going to show you guys a brief video that explains some of the testing requirements. It shows you some of the crash tests that we had to go through and that any wheelchair securement manufacturer is going to have to go through to meet that new WC18 standard.
Well, MGA Research is a safety company. If you name it, if there's a safety regulation, MGA does something with that. The industry has some standards set in place to make sure that individuals that are in wheelchairs are as safe as any other passenger in the vehicle if a crash were to happen. So specialty fasteners and tie-downs are used in these vehicles for special needs to make sure that in the case of a crash event, that person would be safe. So today we're testing the wheelchair tie-down restraints themselves, and we're testing ones that are hopefully going to comply to this new portion of WC18 that will include a pelvis belt that's mounted to the chair itself instead of through a separate load path down to the vehicle floor. We were able to provide this product today. It's known as the QRT 360, and it's one of the products that we're going to be introducing into the market that fully meets the WC18 requirements. WC18 and WC19 are sort of the new take on what we'll call the classic SAEJ2249 standard. SAEJ2249 has been around for a long time, and a group called RESNA decided that they were going to go through and sort of take it, modify it a little bit, make it a little bit more practical, and recreate it for not just the wheelchair tie-downs, but actually the wheelchair anchorages themselves. To achieve the requirements to meet the standard, obviously the load requirements being almost double, had a few things that we had to design and a few things that we had to develop. One of them was the webbing, and the webbing that we designed had to meet the 12,000-pound load. The second part of that was designing the retractor that can take in the webbing and successfully be able to retract it in and as well release it as needed. Well, in WC18 to 19, what we're really looking to do is we're looking to test a specific item. So at WC18, we're just testing the wheelchair tie-down. And what that means is we want everything else in the test to be significantly stronger than the item that we're testing. We want it to be what's called infinitely rigid. And that gives us a worst-case scenario on the item to be tested. So we have a rigid wheelchair and we have rigid anchor points all around the vehicle. In order to pass the test, after the test, you have to be able to see the unit once it goes through the 30-mile-an-hour 20G force. At the end, you have to be able to go back to it and notice that nothing has detached. The wheelchair has to be in an upright position. The ADT still has to be seated and in an upright position. And as well, you have to be able to disengage all the anchorages without the use of tools.
The WC19 wheelchair is going to be a brand new thing. You're going to see them in passenger vans that are usually retrofitted for mobility products. You'll also see them on public transportation like buses and trains.
With the WC19 wheelchairs, having an integrated flat belt allows the person in the wheelchair to, on their own, tie themselves in. One of the benefits of that, the operator has one less thing to worry about. All he needs to do is anchor the tie down right to the wheelchair and hook the shoulder belt to the occupant's flat belt, the occupant to be secured.
Well, that's a lot of what we do. You know, there's what we call minimum performance standards, but a lot of companies choose to do what they call due-care testing, go above and beyond.
Definitely OEMs and manufacturers should look at the new recommendations as well as their suppliers. We want to always be ahead of the ball. With these new standards that do come out, they're only meant to help improve the way that these tests are being performed. So to avoid them and not pay attention to that, we're not surprised. We tested the QRT 360. We performed 2 complete tests. The first being with the lap belt anchored to the floor, and the second one being with the anchor to the wheelchair itself, and in both cases we passed the 2 tests.
Okay, guys, so that's it for us. We'll be obviously here to answer any questions. Just wanted to mention before I turn it back over to Gina, later today or maybe early tomorrow, Gina will be sending out a link with some information on everything we talked about today. So if you guys had a hard time viewing the videos, there'll be a link to our YouTube channel where you guys can view those videos. There'll be a link, as you see in this presentation, to Resna. We also have we're going to send you guys a copy of what we call our white paper, which is sort of a long, detailed description of all the regulatory changes. If you guys have a difficult time sleeping at night, I highly recommend reading it. It's a bit dense on jargon, but it is really informative, and it'll give you guys sort of a better understanding of those regulatory changes. And those are all things you can feel free to share with your customers about these upcoming changes.
Great. Darren, thank you so much. I'd like to open this up for a Q&A session for everyone right at the moment. Are there any questions? I have one. The WC18 changes. The existing product out in the field, Darren, will that be grandfathered in, or will all of the existing product out there in the field need to be brought up to the WC18 standard?
So Craig, I'll just take this one quickly, and if you want to add anything, please jump in. Okay. So the way these work, the best way to think about these standards is that all the vehicles that are currently in the field, if they were specified inspector equipment to meet that SAEJ 2249 standard, okay, that at the time of purchase was the legally recognized best practice standard, right? So as far as we can tell, transportation providers are only obligated to meet the standard that's sort of the legally recognized best practice standard that was out there when they purchased the Boston securement equipment, right? So up until the end of 2015, really SAEJ 2249 is still that legally recognized best practice standard. So people aren't obligated to retrofit their fleets to meet this new WC18 standard. From a liability standpoint, they should be covered meeting the previous regulation until the end of 2015. Okay? Now, you might have people who want to retrofit their fleets as they start to see more of these WC19 chairs, just because securement is going to be easier. From a liability perspective, they don't need to go back and retrofit their fleets, their sort of existing fleets. So,
okay. How many WC19 wheelchair manufacturers are there out there? Approximately.
Well, every wheelchair manufacturer who wants to sell to wheelchairs to sort of VA, anyone through the VA,
right,
has to manufacture WC19 chairs. So as far as we know, all wheelchair manufacturers currently manufacture WC19 chairs.
Right.
That's a shift. Prior to 2011, that was not necessarily the case. And the quantity of chairs that meet that WC19 standard that they're now manufacturing has increased dramatically since that VA decision. So every wheelchair manufacturer makes a WC19 chair, and those options are becoming more and more prevalent for customers.
Okay. Are there any other questions from anyone?
Yeah, this is Travis from Cardinal Bus Sales. I know we're talking about all the changes to the retractors themselves. What about the floor track? Has there been, because I know that you guys are coming out with like an Omni track. Now, does that have to be installed in all buses coming up?
Darren, I'll take this one. Great, Craig.
Yeah, this is Craig Gerald. Yeah, we are currently working with Bluebird to get that implemented. That's currently in the process. That will go, hand in hand with the new 360 retractor once it's available. So you're probably hearing that Omni track possibly at state shows, or you might start, possibly seeing it in specifications, but that is coming. And some of the floor anchorages that you're currently using now are already Omni, if that makes sense. that you're currently seeing in buses now, that's already on the slide and click are already on but there will be a L track that's considered on also, and you visibly won't be able to tell a difference.
Okay, physically you won't be able to, but I'm saying, I guess I'm looking down the future. We have had to replace complete floors in buses where we rip out all the plywood and put in whole new track. When the new standards come out, are we going to have to put in the new track, or should we, just for liability reasons?
Well, if it's an older bus, I mean, you're talking about a brand new bus or a retrofittable 10-year-old bus?
Let's say both.
Well, I mean, a new bus the floor is gonna come from the OEM, from the factory. If you guys are doing anything on your own, it would probably be, customer specification. Whether do they want to meet that WC 18 to 19 standard, or do they want to just meet the standard that was developed when the bus was built?
Okay.
You follow me?
Yep. Makes sense.
Are there any other questions? Well, there's no other questions out there in the audience. We're going to wrap this up, and I will follow up later this afternoon or tomorrow morning with the links provided by QStraint and SureLok that they have promised, and also a link to the presentation today, so you can view it at your leisure and share it with other teammates at your location. And again, would like to thank the QStraint SureLok team for presenting today. We surely do appreciate it, and thank you for joining us. Thanks everyone, and make it a great day.
Thanks, guys.